Okay, so we learned last week a little bit about the moon and how it orbits around the Earth. But as it's orbiting around the Earth, we see it as different shapes, and we're going to look at why that happens. So these different shapes are called moon phases, and they're caused because of the orbit of the Earth in relation to, the orbit of the moon in relation to the Earth and the sun. So it's important for you to know first off that the moon does not create any of the light that we see. It is just a ball of rock and dust. It is simply reflecting light from the sun. So remember that the moon is not a source of light. It is just reflecting light from the sun. So the phase we see from Earth changes as the moon orbits Earth. Following a new moon, light starts on the right as a waxing crescent, and we gradually see more light until it becomes a full moon. After a full moon, we gradually see less light until we reach a new moon. During a new moon, we see no reflected light. So these are the moon phases. A new moon is when you see nothing, it's black. Then we start to see a crescent form, and it gets larger and larger until we have a full moon, and then it starts to get smaller and smaller again until we start back over at a new moon. So remember I told you one time on a warm-up that moon phases are a predictable pattern on Earth. So we call it a predictable event because it happens the same way every month, same time frame, same shapes, in the same pattern. And so we're going to look a little bit at why that happens. Okay, so this is just showing you what we see. So the moon phases that we see, you see the crescent, new moon, and then it's going to show, and it's going to start again. And so the light kind of starts on one side and grows to the other side until it fades off, and we see the different shapes. So the reason for that is because of the relationship between the moon's position and the sun's position. So remember, the moon can only reflect light from the sun. So it's not creating any light on its own. So what you see here, if we are standing on Earth, so here we're the little guy, we're standing on Earth. When the moon's orbit is right in between the Earth and the sun, then we don't see any of the light inside. The lit side, as you can see right here, is facing the sun. So we only see the dark side. So that's when we see the new moon. That's when we don't see anything. Now, as the moon orbits, there's always one side lit up and one side dark, right? But since we're here on Earth, we see, it's really hard to tell. This is a really good model, but it's still very limited. We are standing on Earth, and we can see this little lit section when the moon is in its orbit right here. So as the moon's orbiting, we are seeing more and more of that lit up section. And so when the moon is here, we see half of the moon lit up. So that's when we see our half moon. Then it continues to orbit around. And so again, we are seeing the lit side, and we're seeing only the part that's visible to us. And so we're seeing that lit side grow until eventually we see a full moon. So when we see the full moon, that's because the moon's orbit is a little bit tilted. And so that's why, even though it seems like, looking at this model, it seems like no light should be reaching the moon, right? But the moon's orbit is actually tilted, so it goes slightly above the Earth, and so it's able to catch all that light from the sun. And so we see the entire lit side of the moon at this point in the orbit. And so we see it as a full moon. After the full moon, the moon continues to orbit around the Earth, and we are standing on Earth, and so we are seeing, again, the different shapes of light. And now we're going to see the light fade. We're going to see it get smaller. So you can see the shapes up here getting smaller. And so we're back to another half moon, and then it's going to be a crescent again and back to new moon. So the main thing, I know this is a difficult concept to wrap your head around, especially when we don't have very good models. But the main thing that you need to take away from this is that the reason that we see different shapes of light, the reason that we see different phases, is because of the orbit, is because the moon is orbiting around the Earth. And because it's orbiting around the Earth, it is continuously reflecting different shapes of light to us, or we are seeing different shapes reflected as it orbits. So that's your main takeaway. And so just to show you, one day So remember the one entire orbit for the moon takes about 27 days. And so one day it's just going to move about that much, right? Whereas an entire month would look more like this, as one complete orbit. All right, but your main takeaway here, I know I'm throwing a lot at you. Your main takeaway here is we see different phases of the moon because the moon orbits the Earth. And as it is orbiting, it's constantly reflecting light from the sun. But because of where we're standing in relation to the moon and the sun, we only see a small part of the reflected moon, of the reflected light, depending on where the moon is in its orbit. Okay. All right. So we're going to label the moon phases. So we have, whenever we can't see the moon on those nights, whenever you go outside and it's so dark because you don't see anything, that would be our new moon. Okay. Now, after the new moon, we're going to start to see a crescent. And because the crescent is trending larger, so that the crescent is going to start to show us more and more light. So we call it a waxing crescent because it's going to start getting bigger. Then we see a first quarter. We call it the first quarter because it's the first part of the cycle. Then we see a gibbous. So the bigger these are crescents. And then these larger sections that are almost a full moon but not quite are called a gibbous. And so we have a waxing gibbous when it's getting larger. And then we have, of course, a full moon. That one's easy. Now we're going to see another gibbous, but now we're going to start to see the light go away again. The shapes are going to get smaller again, so we call it a waning gibbous. Then we have last quarter, because we're entering the last phases of the cycle, and then waning crescent. And then we go back to new moon. So the cycle repeats over and over again every month. All right, so again, this is just to show you, showing you the different phases that we see. All right, so we are filling in the phases of the moon that we see. So when the sunlight is coming in, let's say we're standing on Earth, sunlight is coming in from over here. So when the moon is here in its orbit, when it is in between us and the Earth, sorry guys, when the moon is in between us and the sun, it looks like this. Well, let me go back to my simulation. So when it's here, when the moon is right here, we're standing on Earth, and look what we see. We see only the dark side of the moon because the sun is on the other side. So essentially the moon is almost like blocking the sunlight. It's not because it's not big enough, but we don't see the lit side. And so when the moon is there, we call it a new moon. Then as the moon continues to orbit, we're going to start to see, you can see this little crescent forming here, right there. See right there. So you imagine we're on Earth and we are seeing this part of the moon. And so look, we see all this dark side and then we see a little sliver of light. And as the moon orbits, we're here and we start to see that sliver of light get bigger until we finally see a full half. And then now, so we're standing on Earth, we're looking at it from here. So we're seeing this big section of light here and a small crescent of darkness. So now we're seeing that gibbous. Okay, so we have the crescent, we have the first quarter, then the gibbous, and then we see a full moon. Remember, the full moon happens when the sun is on the opposite, when the moon and the sun are on opposite sides. So when the Earth is between the moon and the sun, that's when we see our full moon. Then it goes back down to a waxing gibbous, and then last quarter. All right, and that is it for your notes. I know, guys, moon phases are always very hard to understand and very tricky, and especially when we have limited resources as we do now. But the main thing that I want you to take away from this section on moon phases is, number one, the moon phases are predictable. They repeat every month, and a full orbit of the moon takes about 27 days. The other thing that I want you to take away is that the reason we see these different phases is because of the moon's orbit around the Earth. Because of the moon's revolution around the Earth, different sides get lit up, and so we see different shapes of light. So that is your main takeaway, and that's going to conclude our space notes. But remember, don't turn this in yet. We have lots of notes left for this third quarter. So don't fill these in yet. And don't turn it in yet because then you won't be able to edit it.